Welcome back to the NanoCruising podcast. This is Stefan Marceau, your host. This week we talk with Alan Mulholland from the YouTube channel RoversAdventures, probably better known as Wave Rover. You will find out how he built his first boat. You will find out about the Mark III windvane that he's created. You will find out about the modifications he did to his Contessa 26 on his first voyage. This episode is packed, so stay tuned. So thank you, Alan, for joining NanoCruising to do an interview with NanoCruising. I've followed you. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have followed you for years from your beginning on YouTube. Really, it's with the Contessa 26, and now with Wave Rover 2, the 19-foot boat. We'll cover a lot of that today. But first of all, Alan, thank you for coming. And if you could start a little bit about your sailing background before you even got into the YouTube and before even your first boat. I realized afterwards that I had heard you had gone to the Pacific, but only actually the last episode you published last week provided a lot of background information, which you probably didn't detail as much, but hinted about. So I didn't realize you had built the first boat all by yourself and went to the Pacific. I knew you had gone to Pacific. I had no idea if it was with a group or it was alone and so on. So anyway, I'm rambling on. If you can just go let me know about your background and maybe the Pacific trip and that boat.
Yeah. So I'll just start with, when I was 13, I was in Sea Cadets. And this is in Edmonton, Alberta, which is a landlocked province in Canada. So what we have are lakes. Mm-hmm. And so I would go sailing on the weekends. I loved it, and these were little boats called tumbleweeds. I don't know if there's any other even around anymore, but we had a great time with them. And so that was my introduction to sailing. And the instruction wasn't great, let's say, but, you couldn't really get in trouble on the lakes either. So it was a lot of fun. And if you really enjoyed it like I did, you learned as you went.
Right.
So that was my introduction. I was lucky enough to get accepted to the Royal Military College in Canada, which in Canada, that's very similar to West Point or Annapolis in the United States. Yeah. Many of the listeners would know that. In Canada, it's called the Royal Military College. And I spent my first 2 years at Royal Roads, which are on the West Coast. And I was on the sailing team in the first year, and we were sailing 420s, and that was great. Now, I was destined to be a naval officer, so after graduation, I got a naval commission, and I had done all my training. There's not really a lot of sailing in the modern Navy.
I didn't even know there was any.
Well, there's at that point, it was the dying end of it. We had 28-foot whalers on the ships. Now, those boats are gone. They're inflatable ribs that have replaced them. But if you can imagine, it was a rowing sailing boat that could take an outboard engine. That was the sea boat that most of the ships had when I was going to sea.
Wow.
So, I really enjoyed that, but it wasn't that important to our training. Most of our training dealt with, the professional aspect of being a bridge watcher, keeping officer. In that, I learned a lot about weather, learned a lot about the sea, I learned a lot about big ships and maneuverability. It was very helpful. But then after that, I totally did an about turn, and I became a carpenter, or I started a carpentry apprenticeship. And it was a 4-year-long apprenticeship, and I completed that. And by the time I completed that, I had my head wrapped around the idea that I was going to build a boat, because I saved up all my money as an apprentice, and I had savings left over from being in the Navy. And, it's in my DNA to be frugal. I'm always able to save money regardless. I tend to live a very unextravagant life, and people would meet me, they probably go, well, that's pretty boring. What do? You read books. You don't seem to. Well, anyway, so I was able to put the money together to build that boat and take the time off. And I built it fairly rapidly. It was built in about a year. It was a 26-foot bilge keel,
Right.
Brent Swain design. Brent Swain is BC, a West Coast designer.
Okay.
And
Not familiar with those.
he's got this method of building steel boats. He has three designs, and basically he calls it the origami approach. You cut
Really?
a shape out of the steel, you draw that shut, and you weld it shut, and you've got half a hull really fast. It's a very fast way of building a boat.
So was it a steel boat?
Feet.
Steel
It was
boat?
steel, yeah,
Oh,
very
right.
light gauge steel. And it was bilge keel. And when I was building it, I really just had the idea that I would sail up the West Coast, because when I was in the Navy, the West Coast was beautiful, and it's largely uninhabited. It's just forest, miles and miles of forest and inlet.
Right.
And I thought, wow, you could sail there and just get lost for months at a time and really enjoy the solitude. And there's fish and fresh water, and firewood. It looked really easy. But while I was building the boat, I met this guy named Winston Bushnell. Now, Winston was a real old school sailor, from the 50s and 60s.
Right.
And I learned so much. If ever I had a mentor, it would have been Winston, and he probably wouldn't even agree with that, but I learned so much just from the way he did things.
Amazing.
And and that's where I really got into the self-sufficiency. Like, you wouldn't buy a cleat for your steel boat, you'd build it, you'd make it. And so that was the way. And he launched his boat. He was building at that point probably his third or fourth boat, and it was a stretched version of the 26. So I think it was like 27 or 28 feet. And he took that boat through the Northwest Passage.
Wow.
So that's essentially the same boat as me.
Okay.
So I launched mine about a month after him. And my father had just retired, and he was 60, same age I am now. And I remember thinking at that point, oh, he's such an old man, geez, I'm going to be really looking after this guy. And he just had both rotator cuffs operated on. I mean, just days before. He couldn't raise his arms more than a few degrees. But he figured, oh, that's okay. Don't worry. I'll just still be able to hold the steer. He didn't realize how much motion a small boat would have on the ocean.
Right.
Anyway, we said, yeah, at the very least you could steer. And so he came with me as far as Hawaii, and it was great. It was 41 days to Hawaii. And we encountered all kinds of weather, and but
is that normal? That sounds pretty slow. That sounds pretty slow, is it?
It was, yeah.
Okay.
We had, I think, 8 days in a row in the North Pacific High. It was unusually north for that time of the year.
Right.
And for 8 days, the water was glassy, and we just kind of floated. But
that's okay.
You get used to it, and there's nothing you can do. Now, if you had a motor, you could have motored the probably 100 or 200 miles
and
to get back into the wind,
right,
and be back on schedule, a normal trip. But we had to wait it out because we just had an old Seahorse, 9.9 horsepower Seahorse, and it's an outboard engine, very old. Everything on the boat was old. I mean, the boat itself was new, but the outboard was probably 20 years old. It was a very interesting passage. And then my father, he flew back from Hawaii back to Edmonton. He's a married man. And so I carried on from Hawaii to the island of Tarawa, which is in the Gilbert Islands.
Right.
And I would suggest most people hearing this won't know where those are, but, take a moment to look at them. And it took 29 days to get there. And then from there, I went to Brisbane, Australia, which was 52 days. So the boat was not fast, no, but it was very safe, and the voyage was very enjoyable.
Nice.
It was a very comfortable boat, too, because I lived on that boat then for a year and a half in Brisbane. It was a very comfortable boat to live on, and sailed a little bit around Australia.
Wow.
So that was the first voyage. Then I came back, and I had to get serious about life, earn some money. And
Seems like there's a gap between that boat and the next one, right?
yeah. Well, that voyage started in 1995. So it was about 97. I think it was March of 97. I returned to Canada, and then got married.
Yep.
And I had to, earn a living and build a cottage. And and that was the thing. With my wife and I, Glenda, I always refer to her as Mrs. Rover.
Yeah, I love that. It's so funny. Yeah,
we ended up building pretty much every house we've lived in, and we've lived in quite a few, because that's more or less how I earned my living. I would buy a piece of property, I would develop it, and then sell it. We did that several times. And then we ended up moving to the city. I was wondering, I didn't have a whole lot to do, so Glenda said, "Oh, you should get a boat." And she was thinking like a kayak or a canoe. But I
had bigger ideas.
That as an opportunity to buy an old wreck of a Contessa. I think I picked it up for, in U.S. dollars, about $3,000 or $3,500 U.S. And
is that I think that's the boat that was made famous by Tanya Haby, I guess, the lady. Is that the one that she circumnavigated the world?
She had a brand new one, and she sailed it around the world.
Right. Okay.
So mine was 40 years old. It didn't have hers had an inboard engine. Mine didn't. And it really needed a lot of work. So I spent about a year. I wasn't full-time working on it. I was because of the winter. So, but in about a year's time, I had it ready and launched it, and then sailed that one.
Yes, that's when you created a channel, correct?
Yes, and recorded it on YouTube. And the reason for YouTube, because I didn't understand YouTube or any of that stuff.
You do now.
All I wanted was, well, maybe a little bit, but I just wanted a record. I wanted a record of what I was doing, because the trip across the Pacific just a few years earlier, I have a total of about 3 or 4 photographs.
Man, that's true, right?
And it was such a cool trip across the Pacific. So this time around, I said, well, I'll get a little bit of film. Well, as it turns out, I've got a lot of film now.
Tell me, what drew you to the Contessa 26?
Yeah, so the Contessa, what I realized I needed to do was I needed 360-degree, view. So, and you wouldn't get that from the cabin, because I knew that I was going to build a self-steering, because I had this idea of this self-steering concept. I wanted to build it, and I had a feeling it would work very well. And because I'd been thinking about it for years, and I had experimented with it when I was on my previous boat in Australia. And I kind of discovered every mistake you could make with those. And, I would fix it and find out there's another mistake. And you would fix it. You look at it, it looks so simple.
They're pretty simple, but I guess there's a lot of details. The devil's in the details, I guess.
The ratios that I describe in the building plans for the Mark III are the crucial step to making it work. Otherwise, the thing doesn't work. It doesn't work very well. So a lot of people take pictures of it everywhere I go, and I think to myself, if you splash out the $40 or $45 and buy a set of plans, you'll actually get a much better product. You'll get the exact measurements you need. But anyway,
yes,
there's a fair number of pirated Mark IIIs, and I don't want to take responsibility for their poor performance.
I've seen that, and that's great. On a boat sailing, you need a fake navigator, definitely.
Well, absolutely. Like, you realize quickly you're not going to steer.
No.
Now, on the Pacific crossing, I actually did sheet to tiller steering, which is the most primitive kind of self-steering. So it can be done. I mean, that's a huge trip, and that whole trip was done with sheet to tiller steering. But I also realized how inaccurate it is. So that's why I wanted a windvane self-steering. So that's where my idea of the Mark III came from, the genesis. So anyway, did that, built a little pilot house on the Contessa.
Yes.
Changed all the rigging, fiberglass the hull to deck joint. I moved the chain plates from their position, which was inboard of the bulwark, and moved them outboard to the hull. And that was important because they tend to, well, in my case, they were leaking, but there's a tendency for those to always leak.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the leak in mine, it had destroyed the compression bulkhead under the mast. But that was all kind of known to me before I was prepared to deal with that. And, I replaced that bulkhead and fairly easily. And so and I took out the ice box and I put in a chart table. I really simplified it.
Yes.
I took stuff out of the boat and simplified it.
Yeah.
Because that boat I thought that boat was not really a good sea boat as it was. Like, yes, the hull is really thick and it's strong, but the freeboard is very low.
It's a wet boat, I understand it.
It's very wet, yeah. It's quite tender, especially the first 30 or so degrees. Like, she feels over in a very light breeze. And it was never meant to cross oceans. It was meant to be like a weekend sailor or a club racer. And it'd be great for that. But, people have pushed the envelope on them.
Right.
Including myself.
You went to the Azores with your first trip, and tell us about that.
Yeah, that was terrific. That was the first big ocean crossing on the Atlantic Ocean, taking the boat from from Port Hawkesbury in Cape Breton to the Azores, and came into the Azores, and this is all solo, single-handed, and there's 2 marinas in the Azores. Well, there's really only one, but there's the modern one where they put all the cruising boats, and then there's the old one where the townsfolk are.
Right.
And they put me in with the townsfolk because I was so small.
They're so small.
Not dealing with boats my size. And I was thinking, I wanted to be with the cruisers, and to talk to them.
Right.
But it turned out to be the very best thing. Here I am with the local guys, and they just were so interested in the boat, and I was interested in the Azores. And we got along so great, and I have friends for life in the Azores.
Excellent.
In fact, when I went back to the Azores, I'll skip ahead, but I'll go back.
Yeah. Just now. You were just now.
Just recently, yeah. When I arrived and I came into the port office, the guy stands up and says, "Wave Rover." And I said, yes, how do you remember? That's 5 years ago. And he goes, "Well, you were here before." And I guess they kind of remember me because there was a hurricane, the only hurricane that ever hit the Azores.
I was going to say, I remember there was a pretty nasty storm in the Azores when you were there with the first boat, right?
Yeah, and I was evacuated from the house that I was in, and it was on the evening news, and that's how everybody kind of remembers me. And it's funny, there wasn't the only one. There must have been a couple of dozen people came up to me and said, "Hey, good to see you back." So it was great. And people should remember that. Everywhere you go, you're an ambassador for your country and for your boat. So, bear that in mind. Everything you say and do is being kind of watched. So be on your best behavior, and it pays off. It really does.
Very true.
So getting back to the Contessa, after that, I stayed there. I really enjoyed it. And I stayed there, I think, until September, late September. And early October, it started getting cold. I didn't want to get too far ahead of myself because I knew my next stop was the Canary Islands, and I knew I wouldn't be able to leave the Canaries until the end of November.
Right.
So I wasn't really in a rush. And I really enjoyed the Azores, and it was fairly inexpensive to keep a boat in the Azores.
Right.
So, especially a small boat. So I left the Azores, and I sailed directly to the Canaries.
Okay, so you didn't go to Madeira, all the other islands on the way, right?
No, I was going to, and I have my little inReach communicator, and I'm communicating with my wife, and I'm having her email the marinas in those places because there's no anchorage, or there's practically no anchorage. And they're all full because it's that time of the year that everybody's doing this.
Right.
So I had to miss all those places. And she finally found a spot for me in Lanzarote. So I pulled in there, and I was there I think I might have been there for 3 or 4 weeks. And I used that time to fly home for 2 weeks to take care of some business. And then back to the boat, got the boat ready, and then set sail from Lanzarote and headed south
Until the butter melts, as they say.
Exactly, until the butter melts, and you start to feel the trade winds fill in, and then as they do, you start heading westward. And I was heading westward, and my plan was to go right through the Caribbean islands, through the Windward Islands, all the way to Panama. I wasn't planning to stop at the Caribbean.
Right, true. Right,
true.
true.
I wanted to get on schedule, keep on schedule. To
You had a schedule in mind, and you were behind schedule in your mind, I guess.
Yeah, that was the plan. But then, about 700 miles from Martinique, which is one of the Windward Islands, that's when I got hit by the rogue wave, which was a really sort of interesting thing. And it took me a while to even figure out what happened, because like every kind of emergency that happens on a boat, or every kind of challenging circumstance, it always seems to happen sometime after midnight, in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a partial moon, and the hatch was partially open because it is the tropics, it is hot.
Mm-hmm.
And the Contessa, even though like my boat now, Wave Rover 2, is far more ventilation than the Contessa. So the Contessa was a bit of a hot box. So I had the hatch opened about an inch, and it has a fair weight. But when I heard this big noise, it was like a freight train coming toward the boat.
Wow, sorry to leave you a little bit on a cliffhanger here. But in the next episode, we'll talk all about this famous rogue wave incident that he encountered. You will also find out about how he built his new perfect boat for his next challenge. You will also find out about his new adventures. So come back for the next episode. In the meantime, to keep abreast of the NanoCruising activities, go on our site, nanocruising.com, and subscribe. If you want to join the conversation, join our NanoCruising group on Facebook. And finally, I have created a survey, and I would welcome your input, your opinions, and ideas to steer the show in a direction that you would appreciate. As mentioned, if you enter your email address, you will receive a guide to cruising that we're working on. Thank you, and until next time, as usual, seize your own adventure.